Good afternoon. My name is John Papa, and I'll be speaking to you about, it's a very long title, let's see here. Advanced Topics for Building Large-Scale Applications with Microsoft Silverlight. This session is basically going to cover a lot of real-world implementations that I've had experience with doing Silverlight applications using MVVM and other patterns, variations of MVVM, model view, view model. We'll also talk about Prism and how that plays into it, Unity, a dependency injection tool that we can use, some other options that are available as well. And I'll talk a little bit about what do you do when you've got some gaps at this point. So you've got this application, you're using Prism, you're using MVVM, you're using something to get your application out there. These patterns are great, but they don't solve every problem. So how do you get beyond the other ones? So we'll talk a little bit about those as well. And I believe we have an hour, so we're trying to keep it into there. So here's our outline. We'll talk about MVVM, model view, view model. We'll talk about what it does. We'll start from the basics there. We'll go through that, how it works. And I like to talk about MVVM from a practical standpoint of what each of the components does at its heart. You're going to see in the real world lots of ways to do MVVM. I always get asked, what's the best way to do MVVM, or what's the right way, is the question I usually get asked. Problem is, there's no right way. It's a pattern. It's not like math, where it's 1 + 1 is always 2, and sometimes it's 3. No, MVVM is a pattern, and you can do it many different ways. So I'll talk about some of the ways that you can do it, some of the ones I prefer, and the pros and cons of those. We'll also talk about where it works well and where it doesn't. In the context here, we'll only be talking about Silverlight, because that's the topic. We'll get into Prism, why I call it an enabler of MVVM. Prism is a great technology. It's a great tool by the Patterns and Practices team. We'll talk about what it works for, what it doesn't, how it fills in the gaps, what other options we have. I'll also mention, now that I can, some of the features of Silverlight 4 along the way. I have 2 laptops up, one running Silverlight 3, one running 4, just to show some different features that are available. So I'll show a couple different demos of how different things work and how Silverlight 4 can help us build better applications. So the goals of today's session are to understand MVVM's role in building Silverlight applications. Primary applications I've written with Silverlight have been to help companies, mostly medium to large size, build business applications. Line of business is the term you always hear, using Silverlight and MVVM. I've done some using things like MVP or MVC, other patterns. We'll talk about what these are and why MVVM seems to make more sense in Silverlight than the others. And there's different ways to accomplish those goals. We'll show it in action. Because the one thing I can't stand is when somebody gets up on stage and talks about all this great stuff and they never show you how it works. So I'm a visual guy. I'm going to show you lots of code. I'm going to show you a couple slides. Actually, I've got more slides than I normally like to have. I'll whip through a lot of those quick, and I'll get right into the code for you. We'll talk about Prism, and I've got a framework I wrote for myself that I'm going to give out however I can distribute it. Probably just on my blog site for now, that's a screen presentation framework that fills in some of the gaps between what MVVM does and Prism and some of the other technologies. So we'll talk about all these different things. First, what's MVVM? Do we need another acronym? Probably not. I've heard it called a lot of different things, and model view view model is the one that seems to be sticking. Seems to have come out of the, it's got some roots in MVC and MVP, model view controller, which I'm sure you've heard of, the ASP.NET MVC patterns that Microsoft has. There's the MVP, the model view presenter. When WPF was first starting to get really popular, MVP and MVVM were being used quite a bit. What do these really mean? Well, forget what the letters mean and what the patterns are. The reason they exist is people wanted to have a consistent way to develop these applications. What can I do that's a consistent pattern when I have a team of 1 or a team of 50 that'll help me develop applications, make them maintainable and scalable? And patterns kind of fill that gap. They fill that need, that comfort that we need. So MVVM allows us to do that with Silverlight well, in some cases more so than MVC and MVP. It can be debatable. Now, do you need to do MVVM or any of these patterns to do Silverlight? The answer is no. You don't need the patterns to do this. They help you fill certain needs, and I think you'll see those as we go through. So What and why would you want to use MVVM? It's a separation of concerns. That's the first thing. If you're really into testing and testability of your applications, unit testing, for example, MVVM is great for that because you can test each of your components. Your views, your models, and your view models are all separated entities that you can use, and they can talk to each other. You don't have to couple them. You can keep them very loose. The view will handle your UI. We're running out of words to call things, so your view is kind of like your screen. It handles all your presentation of information. Your model contains your pure data. Your model is like you create an HR application. It's your employee object. Your view is the screen that displays that employee information. Well, that data just doesn't get onto your screen. Something's got to happen to make it go there. And maybe there's logic that's involved in it or any kind of buttons that help you navigate through that employee information. That logic and communication between the view and the model is what's handled by the view model. The view model is built to represent the data for the view. The data being the model in this case. So the view model can represent the data differently than the model actually represents it. This is important for when you get beyond demo code and you don't just have a single object. Because a lot of times you'll see a demo, and I'll even show you one today, where you've got an employee object or a product object, and your model looks almost exactly the same as your view model. It doesn't always work out that way, though, in the real world. So you might have a model that has a product in it, but your view model not only needs to show products, it needs to show other information, like customer information, or categories, or something else altogether. Maybe they're related, maybe they aren't. The view model can pull that data together and represent it to the view the way the view needs to see it. So your view model is built to talk to that view. Think of it as a translator in some ways. It also handles really, really well the bindings that Silverlight's really good at. XAML binding is really, really important, as we all know, in Silverlight and WPF. So with our view model, we can bind it directly to our view through things like commands or through the data binding. So putting it all together, our view is displaying our data and our controls. Our view model is our UI-friendly entities. It's the version of our models and the bindability that we get in handling the actions from our views. The model will represent that data for us. And I call this the MVVM triad. It's the group that works together to give you this pattern. So first, quickly, the model represents the data. It's the entity. The model is not required to know where it gets its data from. This is where you'll see different variations of MVVM. The model is not required to know where it gets its data from, but it can. That's up to how you implement this. The model, in its roots, to be a model, has to have data. That's it. It's a data entity for your UI. I prefer to not let my model know how to get its data. I like the single responsibility principle in patterns. It says every entity that I deal with has one responsibility. Makes it easier to test, makes it easier to maintain and debug, especially for the person who comes after you. So with this case, the model would then only have one job: hold my data. Somebody else will fill the model for me. That's how I go about it. You can also contain validation in there, maybe using the data annotations that are built into the .NET Framework for required fields and whatnot. So the view, it's the screen. It's the UI, the look, the feel, the presentation. It communicates with the view model through bindings. The view model is kind of the meat of it. The view model is the main source of logic for that triad. It connects the model to the view, abstracts the view. You can use these interfaces, iNotify property change, for example, to talk from the view to the bindings. How many of you here have used the iNotify property change interface? A lot of you? Great, glad to see that. So that interface is very, very simple. It has a single event on it, property change. It allows the objects to notify the UI, hey, something about me has changed, and which is at the heart of data binding inside of Silverlight and WPF. So the view model will raise these events up, let the UI know what's going on, and it listens for changes. Now, when I mentioned the model could go out and get its own data and fill itself, and I prefer not to do that. What I do prefer to do is I like my view models to be the ones in charge of filling my models. So the view model's in charge of handling getting the screen ready. It gets everything ready so the view can display it and the data get ready for the model. That's its job. But at its heart, the view model doesn't have to do that. The basic features of the view model is it has to collect the information, abstract the view, and represent the data to the view. And I'm talking very high level first because there's different ways to go. And this is where the discussion of variations come in. As long as you maintain the spirit of each of the components of the triad, depending upon which variation you use, it's not real important. One of the variations is something called view first. And there's good points and bad points to this. View first means you create the view model as a static resource inside the view's XAML. This is great if you like Blend. How many people here use Blend to develop Silverlight? Good portion, okay. If you use Blend, you might like this because then you've got your view model available to your view, so when you're inside a Blend, you can see the properties and the names, and you get strongly typed objects. It makes it much easier. Makes it blendable, if you will. One of the downsides of creating a view model inside of a view through a static resource is now you've tied that view model to that view. He's directly tied to it. It's a little less coupled. And if you use something like dependency injection, when you create something as a static resource inside a XAML, you can't have any arguments in the constructor. And dependency injection requires that you have interface or something else in the constructor to do so. So you might have to do like property dependency injection if you want to get around that. So there's some cons to it. You have to work around it if you're using DI, dependency injection. Another way to create the view model is to create the view model in the view's code behind. So that way you're still doing view first. A view gets created and it cranks up the view in the code behind. There's two ways to do that. The more popular way that I see out of these two is to create the view model as a static resource. So let's take a quick look at a demo that does this. All right, so first we've got a simple demo. Oops, that's not a simple demo. I'm on the wrong laptop. How many laptops can I bring to my presentation? Let's see. All right. So here is Dev 10 running Silverlight 4. And we've got a solution over here, which is not so much a real-world application, but it's going to show our demonstration real quick. And here we've got a view. It's our product view. We're going to display product information. We've got a view model, which is going to get that information for us, and we've got a product model. So let's start with the model, because he's usually the easiest one to look at. So here's our model. And you can see inside of here he inherits from a model base class, which really all he does is he implements the iNotify property change interface that we were discussing. And then I've got some information about my properties, like, hey, put the data annotations on this product ID and mark it as read-only. Somebody can change it. I've got some validation business rules in here that I can implement as well. I've got a product name with some validation. But these are all just properties. If you don't want the validation, you could rip this code out. It'd be fine. So all of that is the model. It's just saying, when I have data, here's how I handle the data. There is no code inside this model to do anything other than represent the data. So now let's look at our view. And I think I've got Blend open. There we do. It's a very exciting view. So we've got a data grid, and we're going to load product information into this data grid through data bindings when we click on the load button. Flipping over to the XAML just to show what we're doing here. First, that's the key line of code. What I'm doing here is I'm saying I have a view model, and I'm going to bind it to this view as a static resource. I'm doing view first MVVM. My view model is going to be created as a static resource right here. And to do this, I had to create a local namespace reference right there. And then inside my grid, where everything is bound, I've got my data context set to the static resource called VM. And once I do this, I can now do my bindings to the field names inside that VM. That's why when you look at my data grid, you see the word product name in the header. Because it knows, the view knows what type the view model is, so it's strongly bound to it. So if we click back over to Visual Studio, we can now see our product view model. And our product view model, pretend it's actually hitting a database to get this data. It goes out and creates an observable collection of products, which we're creating. That's actually a database call. You're not really seeing this. You will laugh. So, now we can set up a command, when we'll talk a little more about what they mean, and it's basically a way to trap an event from the view to the view model. And once that command runs, it's going to run a link query saying, okay, go ahead and get the value that's in the text box on the screen, and then run a link query getting all those products and load them on up. And then because this field here, products, is bound, as we saw, it's in the view model and bound to the view, it's going to load the products for us. So simple press of F5. We'll run our application. And for grins, we'll type in nothing. We'll press load. We've got our breakpoint here with a lot of windows. Let's make them go away. My parameter, I'm not sure you can see my tooltip, is blank. I run through the code, and up pops all of my different products. There is no code in the code behind to handle the binding operations or loading of the data for the view, in this case. There could be if we wanted to, but we don't have to do that. So that's the advantage of view first, is I can do this, and I can use my blendability to create the user experience using the blend tools and not just through code and guess at what those strongly typed names are going to be. Okay. There we go. So you can also do view model first. This is another way of handling it. And view model first, as you might guess, is you create the view model first, and it then creates the view. So you got to think about your application. Do you want somebody to create the view first or the view model first? And it may not be obvious why you'd want to make that decision until after you go down a couple applications. If you do the view first, that means your views are always going to be in charge of the view model that's representing them. You're always going to create a view and have one view model tied to a view. If you create the view model first, you're going to lose that blendability because the view model is going to be the one who cranks up the view. You won't be able to create the view model as a static resource in the view. And now you're kind of going from the bottom up. You're composing your objects from the view model, and they create the screens, which may seem a little backwards in some ways, but you can do that as well. It really depends how you want to do this. So there's another way of doing it. There's always another way, isn't there? There's a technique where you take the view and the view model, and you say, you know what, you can both get there at the same time. I'm going to let you tie. And I call this the view and view model marriage. This is not an official title. So we've got this view model marriage, where view must be paired with the view model. So what we do is we create them at the same time through an intermediary object. The advantages of doing this are really, really good for the application, especially when you're dealing with scalability and trying to keep it very flexible. And I'll show what some of those are. The downside of doing the marriage is you do lose the blendability because you're not going to be creating the view model inside the view. So here's how this works. The top couple lines of code are what you do without Unity. You would say inside of this intermediary class, and I call it a screen class, I say, okay, there's a screen class. Its job is to create the view model, new up my view model. Create my view, new it up. And then I set the view's data context equal to the view model. That's the job of the screen class, to put these two guys together. The advantages of doing this, first, you can use dependency injection in your view models with no problems whatsoever. So now you get your testability and your DI. All that's great. Second thing is now you said, I've got a view and a view model. They know nothing about each other. You could reuse a view with another view model, or reuse a view model with two views. They suddenly become decoupled. They don't have to be joined at the hip anymore, which is odd since I call it a marriage. Anyway, so it's a very open marriage. The second option is if you want to use Unity. So in Unity, and we'll talk more about what he does, Unity comes out and says, all right, we can use a little bit of sleight of hand in ways to create objects. So Unity says we've got some interfaces to create our view models. So I've got my view model. I don't have to know the concrete implementation of my view model to create an instance. What container.resolve means is new. New it up. New up my view model. Something with an interface of my view model will then get created. And you tell Unity ahead of time, whenever you see this interface, crank up this concrete class. And the advantages of doing that is you can use your IOC container, Unity, to do a lot of testability. You can mock objects. It's great for unit testing. So we got the same 3 lines of code. On top, it's just using standard newing up. On the bottom, it's using Unity to say, create my view model, create my view, and marry them together in an open marriage. Hopefully they stay together. So we talked about what MVVM does. What don't you get with MVVM? Well, we saw a quick glimpse at commanding inside the first example of what that is. And commanding is basically the ability to invoke an event on your view and have your view model respond to it. When you invoke a command, you demand a response. It's not, oh, I'm firing an event. If somebody listens, that's great, but if not, no. It's, I want a response. It's going to happen. It's kind of like if you just handled an event handler. So the way your view and your view model can talk is through bindings. It can pass data, so why not pass a command? So commands are a way we can do this. Prism offers commands to Silverlight. Now, in Silverlight 3, there is no great way to implement commands without some help. WPF has this. Silverlight 3 did not have great commanding support, so one of the things you had to do is use something like a third-party commanding option. There's a couple like toolkits out there for MVVM. Another option is you can use Prism. Prism is a tool set developed by the Patterns and Practices team at Microsoft. And the great thing about Prism is that it gives you all these gap fillers for MVVM projects for both WPF and Silverlight, like commanding. And you can use just the pieces you want. You don't have to use everything that Prism gives you. If all you want is commanding, that's all you should use. That's why I like it. I don't like when somebody gives me a pattern or a big tool set and says, here's this huge monstrous thing, you got to use it all. Use one piece, use it all. No. Prism, you can use any piece you want, or throw them away. So in Silverlight 3, it gives you commands that you can use. In Silverlight 4, and we'll look at a quick demo of this in a moment, there is better commanding support built into Silverlight 4, as you might have heard this morning in either Karen's talk or Scott Guthrie's keynote. And what this allows you to do is create commands that talk from Silverlight 4 application views directly to view models. So you don't have to use the Prism stuff in that case for that feature. So we'll look at it both ways. So Prism allows you to be picky, which is good, because I like to be picky. Here's some of the features Prism gives you. It gives you a shell. Okay, you start an application and you run out of this room and go, John Papa said I could use MVVM, I'm going to create some views, and you download my demo of my data grid and my button, and you're like, I'm going to create a whole application based on that one screen. And the first thing you're going to realize is, well, what if I want a shell, a container? Where's my menu going to go? Where's my header, my footer? Where's all the screens going to pop up and display? That's what we call the shell. Prism gives you the ability to create this shell. It's basically your container application where all the other stuff's going to pop up and display, for Silverlight in this case. So it allows us to do that, and inside that shell, there's something called regions. Regions are areas in the shell where you can pop things in and out. You can have one region, very simple region style, or you can create many on the screen. You can create modules. What if you want to create an application where this side of the room is going to create an application that's going to integrate with this side of the room's application, but they read them completely in separate rooms and they never talk to each other until they're done? With Prism, you can create these modular apps. Maybe they're creating a land application and they're creating something that handles traffic lights for governments. They can develop them separately, and later on they can tie them together and they can invoke each other's commands using Prism's modularity. The container is the Unity object I was talking about to do your DI, your dependency injection. It gives you that if you want to use it. We talked about commands. Your bootstrapper is just a big fancy word for that's the first thing that starts up your application. So when you start your application, there may be things you want to do. Like if you use Unity, this is where you would tell it, here's all my types, please register them with these interfaces. Event aggregation is excellent. Really love this feature of Prism, and there's nothing in Silverlight 4 that kind of takes this over, so it's something I definitely would recommend looking into using. Event aggregation is a way to invoke an event and then multiple, actually 0 to multiple subscribers can subscribe to it. So why is this valuable? Well, let's say you're invoking something for this side of the application in a module saying, okay, I'm in the land application, and if somebody tries to do something over here, I want to publish off an event because somebody else might need to know that. I don't care what they do about it, but somebody else might need to know about it. If they want to listen, that's great. If they don't, that's fine too. Well, this application comes in a year later and says, you know what, we needed to know when this particular event happens. Well, the whole year this application's been running, that event's been firing, but nobody's been listening to it. There's no errors or exceptions or anything. When this application comes in and starts listening to that event, then it can actually act upon that event. So the event aggregator can help you fire off events and publish them and subscribe to them. It's also great for, even if you develop at the same time, having menus that fire off, hey, load this view, load that view. You don't know where the views are. You don't care. You just want the view to load. I mean, think of it from the user standpoint. They don't really want to know the details. They just want the screen to pop up when they press the button. Event aggregators will help you with that. So I've got a bunch of slides in here, and you can all take them home. There's about 10 slides on each one of these features. I'm going to go through them in the code and kind of show you what these things do. The bootstrapper, we'll look at this. We'll look at the shell. That's the main view. What the regions do for us. How the modularity works. The DI. And we'll also look at some other features of Prism. Let's slip right over to the demo. So here we have an example application using Silverlight 3 with Prism 2, which is all available and it's been available. And I've done this kind of a structure, different variations with several different companies. And it's worked out quite well. Now what you have here is you've got your views, your view models, and then some other classes to help you get started. So let's start right at the basics. Inside of my project, first thing I did is I decided I was going to use Prism because I was creating a store application where we sold food. And in this application, in this case, we're selling widgets. We're using Northwind. We've got a store application. Inside that store application, here's all of my screens inside this folder, my views, my view models to do the bindings. I even have complex views and view models where they actually views that have other views working with each other. So all that's handled inside this store. Then I had another set of developers working on all the maintenance screens, all the, okay, there's a list of products, categories, users, all those basic forms over data type things, and they worked on it in a separate project. These two projects don't talk to each other, they're not referencing each other, they just know that they have views and screens they need to handle. So this one has just one view in it for now, and a view model for handling category maintenance. It's a list of categories. If I look inside of references, you're going to see the DLLs you need to use Prism with, which are these top guys, the composite library DLLs, and Unity in this case, since using dependency injection. And you're only going to see a couple local projects being referred to. The first one is an infrastructure project. The infrastructure, just think of that as your common DLL. Usually when you create a project, nobody ever talks about it. It's kind of like the cousin you don't want to admit that you're related to. You've got this infrastructure project, and it handles all of the common tasks you need to do in your application. For example, maybe I've got some commands that I want to run or some code I want to integrate. Maybe I've got some really cool animation that I want to inject into my application. Maybe I've got a loading display, like, hey, I'm loading, please wait. Things you want to reuse that are not specific to your app. That's your infrastructure, and everybody should reference him. You've got your model. Inside your model is where you're going to have all of your information for your entities, like your products, your categories, and so on, your people. And then here we've got something called the proxy service contracts. This is a project that's local that's going to handle all the data retrieval from WCF or WCF RIA services or ADO.NET data services or anywhere you might want to go to get your information. The advantage of breaking that out into its own project to get its data is now you're not tied to having all your view models or your models knowing how to get that data. Let's say you wrote an application, and this has happened to me several times, where a client says, I want to start out using ADO.NET data services to get my data. You write 50 screens and view models, all of them are talking to ADO.NET data services. And then somebody says, we're not going to use this anymore because we didn't like this. So now we're going to use WCF for your services, or just WCF. Now you've got to change it in 50 places. So one option you can do is you can split all that out into its own project and just have one guy, in this case, we get this eStore service reference, which talks to a WCF service to go get all of our data calls. So you can see all this project is very broken out into a single responsibility principle. Help yourself protect against the future by creating projects that do one thing very well. That way you don't have to change throughout your entire project. So we've got these two modules we talked about. We've got the infrastructure they point to. The model is very simple. Here we've got a product class. We've looked at this same product class in the other demonstration. The infrastructure has a lot of stuff. I like folders, as you can see. I've got behaviors. If you haven't seen Peter Blois's presentation, I'm not sure if it was yesterday or tomorrow, that's a great presentation to see. Behaviors help you out in Silverlight quite a bit. Those are very generic for projects, so you can include those in your infrastructure. I have something I call a busy service. That's basically just a little animation that I pop up on the screen when I don't want the user to interact with the screen, to tell them, hey, look, I'm in the middle of an async operation. Please don't touch me until I'm done. All this stuff is very generic. Any constants I have. Command extensions. I want to write commands. And again, Silverlight 3, I want to write a command that says when somebody talks to a data grid and selects a row, I want that to fire an event and bind to a view model. So I've written a few commands that I'm going to reuse. They're completely generic and go in infrastructure. So all that stuff's the infrastructure. The way this whole thing starts is inside of the Bootstrapper project. The Bootstrapper project has a Bootstrapper class which says, all right, here's the laundry list of things I need to do when I start my project. So let's look at his code. Inside the Bootstrapper, in this case I'm using Unity, I'll inherit from the Unity Bootstrapper, which gives me my container immediately. So you're going to see two things right off the bat we talked about. The Bootstrapper and the shell. The first thing I look at here is the shell view. That's that main container for my application. I'm going to create an instance of that, and then I'm going to display it to the user. This is the main application. And I'm using Unity to do that. In this case, using the container.resolve. This object exists because I used Unity as the base class for the Bootstrapper. I set the root visual to the shell, and then I tell it, you know what? There's modules in this project, in the solution. Go look inside this XAML file, and here's the location of it. The name of the file is modules catalog. Go look in that modules file, and it's just XML. Parse it out and find the modules that I need to load. So this is where I can add in this XML file. I can add in the admin module that we looked at, or the store module, or I can add a third or a fourth module and load those dynamically up whenever the Bootstrapper runs. You could also use MEF to do this in Silverlight 4, or actually you could do it in Silverlight 3 as well with some extensions that have been out there in Codeplex. So once we do that, there may be things we want to run for our entire application. This is why the Bootstrapper exists, to run things that may be needed by other modules. So first, we're going to run the shell's view model. It's shell's a view, so it needs a view model to present data and bind to it. So we're going to create an instance of it. First, we're going to tell Unity, hey, whenever you see an instance of this interface, create this concrete type. And right away, we're going to resolve that, basically news it up. Most of the time, and this is the only time actually you'll ever register the type and then new it up right away. Most of the time, you're going to register all your types, and then if somebody needs it, you'll new it up later. We know this screen needs to run on startup, so we're going to new it up right now. And then we're using the marriage concept here. We say the view's data context should become this view model. Another thing I created here, and we'll talk about this after we get through the next section, is this application controller. This is another thing I want to live throughout the entire project, so it's going to be cranked up inside the Bootstrapper. And then I've got services I run. I mentioned the Visi service. We'll show that in a moment. And there's also something called not an invisibility service, a visibility service. This is a service I wrote that basically says there's a screen over here going away, there's a screen over here popping up. I want to do some kind of transition to make them display. So that's going to be cranked up in the bootstrapper. So these are all common patterns that you can run. And when we run this application, you have to bear with my screen resolution. I click on my product search. I thought I had the resolution knocked. Cut off on the left side of the screen. Bummer. Over here, we've got product ID, not UCT ID. We've got our data. We've got searches. What are we really looking at here? The blue, the dark blue background, is our shell. So I run this application again. Let me refresh the page. That's my shell. That's the shell view. This is the frame around all the other objects. I can now load different menu items. I have this module has a view called product search. This one has an administration for categories. So I can click on the product search. It fires off an event using the event aggregator. It says, hey, somebody clicked this button. Somebody wants to see that screen. I don't have it, do you? And somebody else will say, all right, I've got that. And when it hears that response, the other module, it says, okay, I'll load up my product search screen. In this case, I'll select categories, click search. Did you notice a little loading? I'm trying to show it fast here. That's the busy service. Every time something's happening in the background, I tell the busy service, hey, somebody's busy, show this animation, dim out the screen. Let's try to make it happen again. My computer's too fast, and it displays up there for you. So there we go. All right. Get out of full screen mode. Come back over here. So that's what our services do, and they're cranked up inside of the Bootstrapper project. Now we talked about the event aggregator. He's really important. So what we want to do, and let's do a quick search for the word subscribe, just so I don't have to hunt for it. So in here we've got a place where we're going to subscribe to all the events for our application. This is inside a class I call the screen conductor. This is not part of Prism or anything else. Remember I mentioned there's gaps in what you need to do? Well, in MVVM, we know we can create a view and a view model and tie them together. We know we can display a screen. But what if we want to go from one screen to another? Somebody has to be in charge of loading these screens. Why? Because what if you're on a screen and somebody's editing it and they're not done? And then somebody wants to crank up another screen. That other screen has no idea that this other screen even exists, much less if it's in the middle of an edit operation. So you've got a couple options. You can just let it happen and the data goes away, or you can pop screens on top of each other, or you can have the screens somehow know how to communicate with each other through interfaces, which is what we're going to show. Another option is you could have the first screen pop up and then gray out every other option on the screen until it's done. But it gets complicated to do those things. It's easier to say, hey, implement an interface that allows me to tell everyone else I'm busy right now. So what we're going to do in the subscribe to events is we're going to use the event aggregator of Prism. Prism's going to go ahead and say somebody fired off an event that a screen should be loaded. This screen conductor class is going to sit back, and it gets cranked up by the bootstrapper, so it's always active. Says subscribe to that event. When it's active, call this activate screen method, which is basically going to go in and then fire up, okay, let's figure out which screen's open, which one's not, and we'll proceed from there. Oops. Let's go back to where we were. And then in the view model, this is for the shell itself, we're going to go out and activate and publish that screen event. We'll say, here's our screen, publish the event, this is going to let everybody know I want to load another screen up for us. That's all the view model does. The screen conductor is the guy who's in charge of saying, when that event is done, call this method, and check this option out. Put it on the UI thread. If you've done a lot of Silverlight operations that are asynchronous with anything with the views, you might have run into a situation where you've gone and got a bunch of data, you bind it to your screen, but none of the data ever shows up. Does that happen to anybody here? Yeah, enough people where it's probably caused you some pain. This is the stuff that made me bald real quick. So one thing that we had to do is use the UI thread to get that data to show up. So you go get your data, you bind it to a screen, you might come back on the background thread. And if that happens, you're not going to be able to get that data to the UI thread unless you do something. On your own, you can use something called the dispatcher to do that, or a synchronization context. If you don't want to deal with it, Prism gives you this option through this event to say, what thread do you want to be on when this comes back? I'm activating a screen, so I definitely want the visual to appear. So I'm saying, go ahead and put it on the UI's thread. Or I can say, go on the background thread if I wanted to, or stay with whatever the thread was that was done by the publisher. And finally, one of the other options you have is to say, is this notification relevant? You can ignore the event altogether under certain circumstances. Is notification relevant? You might want to put some code in there to say, well, if the screen wasn't done, don't listen to this event. Or if the user doesn't have permission, don't let them go here. In this case, I'm very nice to people, and I say return true. So you can see the event aggregator has a big role in communicating between modules or classes in just one case where they may not know about each other at all. The shell has no idea the screen conductor exists and vice versa. They don't need to know about each other. And the screen conductor is just a class I created that listens for this event, and then it cranks up a screen class. That's its job. Okay. So we talked about this event aggregator. It allows events of any kind to be published, and you create these events yourselves. You can be filtered out using subscribers, and that's where that is notification relevant method I created comes in handy. And here's a great example. You click on a menu in the shell, the event is invoked by the publisher, it's received by a subscriber. There may not be a subscriber, which in that case the view would never pop up. Or there could be multiple subscribers. Maybe there's multiple places that have views that can respond to this, and you need to use the filter to figure out which one is the appropriate one. We talked about infrastructure. It's a pure library. It doesn't make calls to anything else. It doesn't reference anything else. It's just your common tools inside your project. So looking at the last demo, we get back into the same code base. We've got this code here, and we want to be able to make the modularity work. So we looked at how the screen conductor receives the event. This is how to set this all up. So you create a new view model. Let's look at that code. Here we've got a view called product view, and we'll switch over to blend so you can see what it looks like. I'll scale down the percentage, really tiny. Let's go one lot higher. All right, so here we've got product view. Product view is actually just a container. And the way you can tell this, if I go to the object and timelines, and I hide everything inside the layout, you'll see nothing up in there. What's actually happening is you can see the search panel. Let me make this go over here. We'll hide him, and we'll slide over. So here's our search panel. If I hide him, he's gone. The search panel is another view. This details panel is actually on the back of the view. And there's a toggle button that I'll allow you to show them. So this product view is actually a composite view. When somebody searches in the front, I want the details to show up on the back side. So there's actually three views. There's the composite view that contains everything with a button to switch between the two modes. There's a view that allows us to see the product search, and there's a view that allows us to see the details. So the product search information looks like this. This is what we ran through the application. We can type in a product, and choose a category, press search, and it runs. On product view, you'll see, this is the master view, there's a button over here on the right. You can see it right there. That button allows me to say, all right, once I'm done with product search, flip over and now see the product details. The product detail view is right here. And this guy is on the back side of that other view, and he's using a data form, the data form control inside of Silverlight, to represent the details of the product. So once the selection is made on the search, It uses data binding to say somebody selected this row in the data grid, binds it to the view model, and then it gets over to the view model for the product details, and it gets bound to the view, and the data form will populate itself. So we've got a composite view model in this case, where we've got multiple views in the same place, all running with different view models to load up a single screen. So the way this works is we got those views, and then there's 3 view models that match them. We've got the product view model, the search, and the details. What happens in the search view model, scrolling through the code here, is we're using dependency injection through Unity to create the event aggregator in case I want to listen or publish events, the busy service to tell it when to put up that little yellow spinning thing to say I'm busy, the Unity container so I can handle any Unity objects and operations, and then the proxy service. This is just the name of a class I created that goes out and gets the data. So my view model now has the ability to listen for events, tell the user when it's busy, create objects, and go get data. First thing it does is it tells the user I'm busy. Then it sets a reference to the product service, and it handles its bindings. It's got categories and products. It goes off now and it loads its data. And then when the user clicks the search button, we've got a delegate command here. Prism gives you this delegate command. We create this delegate command which is bound to the view on the screen. Somebody clicks it, we call it the begin search method. So how do we set up this method, this command inside of the view model? Is we create a delegate command property, which has got to be public. This is a place I burn myself a lot, by the way, and you might do it as well. The delegate command property, when you create these a lot with tools like ReSharper or DevExpress's CodeRush or even just Visual Studio, a lot of times they create properties as private. And if they do that and you create this, and I just change that to private, no error will happen, but when you click the button on the view, there's no binding operation because it can't find the command. So a common thing that happens to me is when I click my buttons and nothing happens, I have to remember to go in here and change these to public. So that guy there is going to be the command that in Blend, in this case, or you could do this in Cider. Again, this is for Visual Studio 2008. We could show the binding operation in the view. Let me go to XAML view just to show you where it all lives. Oops. So here we've got a button. We've got a command, colon, that's the namespace resolution. Click.command, binding is going to be bound to search product command. What does this mean? Each point there, command, colon is going to tell you what namespace we're using. This is the Prism namespace for commanding. Click.command says you're going to call the button click event. There's a command that exists. Go find it through the binding operation in whatever you're bound to, in this case the view model, and go find the search product command property. And it's going to call that. And then once it's there, all these other items are going to be bound as well, and it'll display the data for your data grid or whatever else you might be binding to. There is no code in the code behind. There's nothing behind the mirror. So here we have our view for product search. Here's our code behind. It's got more using statements with no code in it. I don't need code to do it in this case. I could put code here if I needed to, but I don't need to in this case. I'm just getting data, binding to the view model, invoking commands and events. And then for the details, once we switch over, he's also got commands for saving and canceling changes. So here we've got a save command event, which is going to be invoked the same way. There's a binding operation inside the XAML for that view. So how do you do this in Silverlight 4? One option in Silverlight 4 for commanding is to use the commanding operations that are available as the new features. So instead of using the command namespace, which we have to reference, notice now we have a command property in the binding extensions. There is no namespace reference. This command property and the command parameter property are used the same name that we use with Prism, but now we get them in Silverlight for free. So we get a command and a command parameter. So we can say when somebody clicks this button in Silverlight 4, bind to the command called load products, and pass to it a command parameter using some other good features. So here we got a command parameter is, all right, I don't just want to run the load products command. When it runs, I want to pass a parameter and bind that parameter to the view model. And get your value using the element name binding from a filter text box, which is just up here. I'll go over and show you. And then you're binding to the path of text. So back in your view model, back in the Bat Cave, we've got our command set up inside the view model as a delegate command. And I'm saying, all right, when somebody clicks this, call load products. One of the features of commands, whether you're using Prism or the Silverlight 4 version of these, is that not only can you call an event like load products, you can also optionally disable or enable the button. So if you pass the second parameter, which is optional, this parameter must be a delegate that returns true or false. So in this case, I'm doing can load products. If this returns true, that button will be enabled. If it's false, it will be disabled, which is great when you're like making changes on a screen. You want a save or cancel button to enable or disable based upon whether the state of the object is dirty or has changes. You can use this method to do that. So in this case, wrong key. My can load returns true. That's a lot of logic. And then I've got my load command property here. Notice he's just implemented as an I command. So not everything is perfect with Silverlight 4 yet. There's still one more step we have to do. While we don't have to use Prism to get commanding in Silverlight 4, you do get the command binding extensions, but you don't get the delegate command object for free. This delegate command does not exist in Silverlight 4. You have to create it, and there are several variations out there you can use. I've got one here that I've written. It's a very simple object. The delegate command has 3 properties. For can execute, that's that method's going to return true or false to enable or disable buttons, or whatever the object might be. Execute action is going to be the method that's going to run when you click the button, and then there's going to be a cache for it. So you can just take this code, because I'm giving this code out, or you can find your own implementation of delegate command, or steal the one from Prism or anywhere else. But you need this implementation of a delegate command so you can actually invoke and do something in the view model. But the binding operations are very different whether you're using Prism or not, in that in Silverlight 4, there is no namespace you have to reference. You just go ahead and you write your commands. Much simpler. In Silverlight 3, just to make sure this point is very clear, here's my command. And you notice I've got the command colon in there. That's because up top, I've actually referenced that namespace to the DLL for Prism. So here's the command, namespace reference, and it goes to Microsoft Practice's composite presentation commands. If I took this out and try to compile the application, you'll notice I've got that dreaded red underscore. Doesn't know what it is. Doesn't have any idea what a command is. Cool. So commands are a great feature in Silverlight 4 that we can take advantage of with these. So I talked a bit about this screen presentation enabler. That's a piece that doesn't really exist in MVVM or Prism or these other tools that are out there. It's a way of handling navigation. There's also the navigation framework that you can use that Read Services takes advantage of as well. If you're looking into that, there's actually some really good posts on how to integrate that with Prism out on the web. I believe David Hill is the gentleman from Microsoft who did a really great post on doing that. Brad Abrams and Dinesh are going to have sessions, if they haven't already, on Read Services. I think they're tomorrow, showing how some of that works too. If you're interested in Unity or using DI containers or just composition in general, you might want to catch the session by Glenn Block that's here. And all these are recorded, so if you haven't caught them, don't worry about it. Glenn Block is doing a presentation on MEF, the Managed Extensibility Framework, which is part of .NET 4. You've already got it if you've got the Silverlight 4 bits. If you downloaded them this morning, they integrate with Silverlight 4, so you can use that stuff. It's really, really good. And if you're looking for the code for my stuff, it'll be up on my site later today. And it's perfectly free, no licensing, just a well-placed bottle of wine is always nice. But, you know, I'll take whatever I can get. And finally, some other information out there. Patterns and practices have some great stuff. I really want to sum up by saying what you do and how you do it is more important to the sense of make it something that the team can all use, can all follow, something that's consistent, follows some of the patterns that are out there already. You don't have to use every pattern that's ever existed. You know, we've all heard and talked to people who are like, you have to know the 4,000 patterns that exist in the world and create your application. You don't. They exist to help us. Choose the ones you need, ignore the ones you don't, follow the patterns you need to get to, make your application scalable. If you're looking for the code, again, check my blog site. If you follow me on Twitter, I put a lot of information up there. There's actually, I think it's a 20-page article I wrote on this topic that's going to be posted to Patterns and Practices, I think, in the next week. So check that out. You can follow me on Twitter to see when that happens. And if you would be so kind, I'll stick around for some questions. I'm trying to speed up a little bit here. I'll stick around for some questions if anybody has any. But please fill out your evaluations. I believe they're actually donating $1 to the Boys and Girls Clubs of America if you do so. So please do so. And thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, please step up to the mics.
Check. I've got a question for you.
Yes.
Right here in the center.
I can't see anybody, so just talk.
With the commanding built into Silverlight 4, what if that control has multiple events? How do you specify which event you're being bound to?
If the commanding in Silverlight 4 has multiple events, you can bind in Silverlight 4. What you're going to do is you're going to create a command, and you're going to bind it to a one control to one command back inside your view model. If you want to have multiple things happen based upon what you click a button or something like that inside the view, you'd probably still only have one command. You just have that command do multiple things. If you're looking to have multiple disparate events fire based upon an action, that's where you'd use the event aggregator.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Hey, hello.
Yes, these are my cards right here. Sorry.
John.
Yes.
So, based on the patterns that you just described, that patterns give me scalability for my Silverlight developments that I do?
Yes, the patterns that are out there will help you make your applications a little more scalable, a little more widespread.
Okay, wow. Okay, so
Yes.
following the recommendations that you are saying, I can have scalability. I feel that I have a lot of maintainability with my code and stability for the future, but scalability, I was expecting more things about this talk.
Yeah, there's lots you can do to make things more scalable. A lot of that's performance, keeping your zap files down, what you get in the content. There's a lot of ways to do that, and I'd be happy to talk to you about specific instances. One of the things I look for in scalability too is how many modules can you plug in? How many views? What happens when you get 200 screens in your Silverlight application? And building something like this, while I only showed 4 or 5 views, and some of them composite, you can really build those into your application.
Okay, well, thanks, and great talk, great code. Thank you.
If I could take one quick time out, I already missed most of you, but there's a Birds of the Feathers session tomorrow morning on MVVM and the tooling, RIA services, MEF. That's, I think, INET is sponsoring at 8:30 in the morning. You might want to catch.
Hi.
Question over here.
Yes.
Okay.
It's not directly related to what you've talked about. It's slightly related. Have you come across a good solution where in Silverlight 3 the navigation framework basically takes control of loading the view? Therefore, you sort of you have to do like a property dependency injection or something like that to get for your view model to be created from there. I noticed in Silverlight 4 there was ability to hook into the onNavigate to be able to.
Right, you can override how some of it works in Silverlight 4.
Yeah.
Very honest with you, and I'm always very honest, sometimes through fault. The way the navigation framework works in Silverlight 3 isn't nearly as easy as I'd hoped it would be to work with some of the Prism and modularity aspects. One of the great parts about that, though, is the gentleman I mentioned earlier, David Hill, and I'm not sure what team he's on at Microsoft, he wrote a really great post that shows you how to use Prism with the navigation framework and still get the benefits of both.
Yeah.
Silverlight 4, it's expanded on that, and it's something I'm actively working with the Microsoft teams to figure out how do we work these large-scale applications with navigation frameworks?
Yeah.
There is no great solution today, though.
Yeah, because I mean, it's almost that you can do everything that you want to do with regions, but you don't want to give away the ability to do deep linking and getting history in the browser.
Exactly. The deep linking is the big thing. You want the back and forward buttons to work and all that. And it's difficult when you don't want to link right to the URI. But there are ways around it. His post in general is a session all on its own. I wish they would have done that here. Check it out.
Thank you.
Yep.
Question?
Yes.
Over here. So commanding works really great with buttons. Does it work good with other controls, like combo box or list box, for example?
Yes and no. Yes, it's great with buttons, and it doesn't work with the others out of the box. But what you can do is, if you remember inside my infrastructure project, let me point you to that real quick. I have some command extensions I wrote for the data grid row selected event, the menu clicked. It was a custom third-party control I wrote one for. The selector for list boxes and combo boxes and items controls and whatnot. The tree view. I wrote some commands on my own. They're very simple classes to write. You have to implement the iCommand interface, which comes with Silverlight 3 and 4. So you have to implement the interface and write these classes, and then you can use those commands inside your application as well.
Are any of those going to be built into Silverlight 4 out of the box?
It's something, that's a good question. It's something I actually put up on the user voices site, if you ever looked at that. My biggest thing was I wanted the way to make commands bind directly to view models without me having to write all these. The downside of that is I really don't want to have a command class for every event that could ever exist. I mean, you could have 50 of them. So what we're working on is trying to find a way to make it so you can have one kind of, these are my own words, a generic command that you could call and just invoke any event or from any control. That's not in there today, but it's something it's high on my list.
Okay.
Question?
Good. Yes.
With all of these great separation presentation patterns, where is the correct place to put common logic, the real client business logic, which is not specific to some part or some view model object? We have a kind of solution, but I really want to know if it's the correct one or if there is any other solution.
Well, it always depends, and that's always the answer. But your business logic, there's lots of places you can put it. If it's specific to a view model, the obvious answer is you know where to put it. If it's validation logic and it's per entity, like on an employee, you can always put it on the model, and validation logic belongs there. If you have cross-validation logic, meaning multiple properties, you can now do that in Silverlight 4 in the model. But if you have stuff that needs to talk to like web services and databases and all that, I always push that down to the lowest possible point that I can get it to, and that will be on the server in this case.
Okay, but it's a client business logic, so it shouldn't be set on the client, not on the server.
Right.
So
if it truly is business logic, you really probably shouldn't put it on the client.
Okay, so we actually created some creature called controller and place the logic inside the controller.
Right.
And a controller could be shared between view models.
Yep.
Maybe singleton, maybe instantiated, or it depends. So the question is it the correct way to do?
I wouldn't say there's anything wrong with doing that. And there's reasons why. Because think of it this way. WCF RIA services, one of the things you can do with them, if you're familiar with that, is you can create business rules on the server, and then those rules can be shared to the client. One thing I always caution people on, though, is I don't mind having business rules on the client as long as they're also on the server. Because the worst thing you can do, and this has happened to me more often than I can count, where I go into an application as a consultant and I say, in my former life, I go into their application and they have all these business rules on the client, nothing on the server at all to protect their data. And then some other UI comes in and talks to the business server, and they're like, ooh, they're just deleting, inserting, doing whatever they want. So I don't have any problem with the business rules being on the client as long as they're also on the server.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. I think you're up.
The navigation framework, you hinted it might be changed a little in Silverlight 4. Was that right?
Yes, there's a couple new features in there, and if you check out the Channel 9 website, if you go to my blog, I posted all this morning, there's a white paper I wrote, and it talks about the details of the navigation changes. There'll be more coming out more samples to help you kind of figure out what the changes are. But it gives you a little more control over how it works.
Okay, because one of the features I didn't want in the deep linking was, I didn't want people to be able to put URLs and go to specific pages for a business application.
Right.
And I don't know if I could already disable that and I just didn't see it.
There's ways to do that. I'm not sure if the gentleman tomorrow, Eric Mork, is holding a Birds of Feather session in the morning.
That's the one at 8:30?
Yeah, at 8:30. It's not it's an INET sponsored one, but Eric knows that stuff real well too. He might actually show demos of that. I might bring that to him.
I was planning on going there, so.
Yeah, if not, the people who are really in charge, I mean, Brad Abrams. Oh, you're right there, yeah. And Brad Abrams also that's his team. So definitely check his talk out if you have questions on that.
Okay. If I can ask one other question about when you're talking about the view model, you like the pattern of the view model knowing how to get its data. Why is that?
Go ahead.
As opposed to say, having something else marry them or something. To me, I can see that it's simpler that way.
Yeah, what I like to do is, specifically, my view models don't actually get the data. In my code, you'll remember the view model had a method that says, go get it your data. What I didn't show you was it actually calls that other proxy service I created. So the proxy service is another project whose job is to go out and talk to WCF or Astoria or RIA services or whatever it might be.
But you attach it to a specific proxy as opposed to having something say, hey, resolve a proxy and something else gave you some sort of proxy.
It actually attach it to an interface for a proxy service so I can change them out if I want to. I didn't show all the details just because of time, but I'll give you the code on this, and when you look at it, you'll see it actually just looks at an interface to figure out where do I get my data from.
Okay, thank you.
But you don't have to go that far. I want to stress that. There's a lot of complexity in what I'm going to show you, or what I showed you, but you don't have to go that far unless you feel that has value.
Right.
Yeah.
Hi. Can you talk a little bit about delay loading strategies in order to... Hi.
Yes.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about delay loading strategies with the way you have things set up so the user isn't waiting forever to get the application up and running? You want to bring it up as quickly as possible, and then as they drill into areas that they haven't touched, they're going to experience maybe a delay to bring those assemblies down.
Right, there's a couple ways you can do it, and it's all asynchronous, so you've got to work around that structure. But the question is, how do you deal with delayed loading? For example, let's use a simple scenario of you've got an application which you need to load up and fill all your combo boxes before the screen's ever displayed. You don't want people clicking on empty combo boxes, for example. So how do you get the data on the screen, but don't make the people wait for the screen to load? One thing you can do is you can write services to do this, to say, go get your data when your application loads up, maybe in a bootstrapper, maybe through an event aggregator, so it's a little less looser coupled. You can cache that data in isolated storage if it's something that's static. If it's not, you can tell it to refresh. But the way you go and get that data, and I think I do it in this application, I just didn't show it, is you go out and get your data in advance. Let the views still run. Let them run asynchronous.
Actually, that's good, but that's not what I was kind of getting at. What I'm getting at is the first time you load your Silverlight, the first time the user brings up the Silverlight app, right? If you got a pretty big app, right, you don't want them to wait for all the assemblies to come down. And you've got things broken down very nicely, but they're more broken down organizationally as opposed to for performance purposes on the first load of that Silverlight app.
Well, yeah, one of the things you can do, and there's several battles you have to fight. One of them is your zap size. If you break it up into multiple zaps, you can load only the zaps you need on demand. That's one thing you can do, and I believe Eric's going to talk about that tomorrow. You're going to talk about zap loading? He will now. So Eric, I've committed to making him do it. But you can do that. You can make zaps load on demand and do that. You can also use the caching, the zap features. There's a checkbox in the project to allow you to cache your zap files, so that way they'll load faster on second and third and fourth tries. So there's a couple different strategies you can use.
Okay, thanks.
Great.
So I've got a couple of questions. I'm new to Prism, but I've worked on the composite application block, and most of what I see over here seems to have some real parallels with CAB.
Yes.
And, would you be able to contrast CAB with Prism in terms of learning curve, developer experience along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely. If you know CAB, You will have no problem getting into Prism. The biggest differences in CAB was basically Prism 1, or Prism you could say is CAB 2. One of the biggest problems with CAB, and if you remember I talked about Prism, you can use pieces you want of Prism or throw away the pieces you don't want. In CAB, it was pretty much an all or nothing gamble. You use the whole thing or you can't use it at all. So a lot of what's in Prism came from CAB. The good parts, I'd like to say. And they kind of moved forward with it. And that's, so if you're doing composite application block now, you should have no problem getting into the Prism sides.
Because the question that was asked earlier, I mean, I remember there was this exact same problem with the smart client where, you know, you had all these modules and you had
Right.
to wait actually for the modules to come down.
Yes.
Okay. Is there a reference implementation for Prism? And number two is, when I see all those modules and views, CAP provided a way, like a templates for me to actually add the views, and it would actually put it in the right folder. You know, same for the modules, views. Is there something similar for Prism? Or do I have
I'm
do it
trying to
by hand?
recall. I don't think there is in that any automatic stuff like that in Prism.
Okay.
I'm not aware of any if there is.
So you would basically go copy paste, or you know, just do it by hand every time you implement a view.
I mean, for like templates for views and whatnot, you can create your own templates, and that's what I do. I create view templates to start out with. Pretty simple to do. There's nothing in Prism that I'm aware of that will help you do that, though.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I got a couple questions. One, my requirements, basically I need to be able to have a whole series of app modules, but the user may be only authorized for a subset of those.
Okay.
So I have to dynamically load those app modules only for what the user has access to. And that's kind of what I'm working on right now. And the other thing is they want to be able to save a layout of the shell, and then I need to be able to reload that. So that means an app module may or may not be in the same region on each session.
Is that based upon user preferences?
Yes.
Like Joe and Pete have different, yeah.
Yep. And different workstations. So
Sure.
a user could have multiple workstations, and they want to have you know, a saved preferences for each instance of the application across those.
Right.
So I've
Well-
seen some of the issues, but what do you see with that?
There's obviously battles you got to deal with, and there's a couple pieces to that solution. What I generally tend to do is I'll write a service on the client to handle what I call a user profile or user context. So I know who you are and what your specific context information is, whether you like red screens or yellow, or where your regions are, et cetera. That user context information could be database loaded, or it could be XML file cached in isolation storage, depending upon how you want to implement it. That user context usually gets loaded. It's the second step. The first step is the authentication and authorization.
Right.
You've got to use some means of authentication, which you can do in Silverlight.
Yeah.
And you can authenticate, find out who you are, what you're authorized to use. Then you can do dynamic zap loading, which Eric has promised to talk about tomorrow. You use dynamic zap loading to load it if the person has permissions and they get their context.
Yeah, I'm going to hit a WCF service just
Okay.
to figure out who they are, and then return the list of what they're authorized for.
Yeah.
And then ISO storage for their preferences. So.
Yeah, I've used databases and ISO storage, and I find that it's almost a combination of both is almost preferable. Because if
Yeah.
you use the database, at least then you can go machine to machine like you're talking about.
Right, right.
Right.
Thanks.
Sure.
I have a question here.
Yes.
So if you decide to break down the application into several zaps, I'm assuming you can have then one application that loads, you can have one Silverlight application that loads the different zaps. And then do you have something like Prism that kind of help you with like an event aggregator to kind of like coordinate events between the different zaps? Do you have something like that? Or
Yes.
How do they talk?
That's what Prism will do, and in the example I think I have 3 modules. There's the Bootstrapper project. That Bootstrapper project is the one that coordinates all the modules. He's the one who says, okay, when I crank up, look in this XML file to find out what modules exist. And that's the Prism thing, the modularity. I've got a module A, B, and a C. He'll crank those up as needed, or he can crank them all up at once. That's your option. And then you can use the event aggregator to communicate between them.
Are the modules different zaps, or They're different
Different
views.
zaps.
They're different zaps.
They are Silverlight project files, which turn in their own zaps. So if you look in the actual web project, my client bin, you're
Okay.
going to see 3 or 4 zap files.
Okay, I thought they were different views, so they're different zaps.
Ah, yeah, different
Okay,
zaps.
cool, thanks.
Yep. A lot of code to show.
I have a question on that area. Previously, I did a project with Silverlight 2 using this sort of prism layout. But we actually had a problem where each module, the zap file copied all the contents of, like, say, our infrastructure DLL, common controls that we used. And so we ended up just making the client app just reference everything so we got all in one shot as opposed to having every zap copy that. Is that solved with the client cache?
It's not solved with that feature in general, but
Okay.
you can get around it. I mean, there's ways you can do it where the, do not copy and all that, the different settings on the DLL so you don't get them in all the zap files. The infrastructure is a common issue that happens with, generally because your infrastructure ends up getting larger than you ever thought it would be.
Right, exactly.
As you can see in my project, I had 5 views and I had a ton of infrastructure.
Right. And we use component 1, which are very huge libraries and so forth.
Yeah, especially with user controls, that can be an issue. You definitely want to only load those once as you go. There's nothing great that'll do that for you out of the box. There's products that will do that.
Okay.
So you can look into some of the products. Gentleman in the front row, I'm kind of laughing, has a product that does that very well. So it's a
I
good
was
product.
curious. I mean, it was a problem that I ran in about almost a year ago, so I was wondering how that was nowadays. But
Yeah, it's not something I see the team addressing at this point unless I'm not seeing it. And keep in mind, I'm the new guy on the team, so.
Right.
But it's not something I've seen. These are big business problems.
Right.
And I've worked with companies who have 500 screens in a Silverlight application, and they're like, why does it take so long to load?
Yeah.
You know.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, Glenn Block, the MEF talk I talked about, MEF, he's going to be talking about multi-load and composition as well. So they're telling me to get out of the room, so I'm going to take any other questions outside if you have any. Thank you.